In March of 2013, a man named Bo Guangxin stood up at China's National People's Congress and gave a number: 80 billion. That's how many pairs of disposable chopsticks he said the country was producing every year. Enough, laid end to end, to cover Tiananmen Square more than 360 times. That number is the one you'll find in almost every article written about Chinese chopsticks since. But it isn't the only number that's been given. In 2001, the Washington Post reported the figure at 45 billion. In 2009, China's own State Forestry Administration put it at 57 billion. A History of Food Culture published years later cites 63 billion. And in 2013, it became 80. 4 different numbers from 4 different moments, all describing the same thing: how many chopsticks China throws away every year. This isn't a story about which number is correct. It's a story about what happens when an industry gets big enough and routine enough that nobody agrees on how to measure it. Reusable chopsticks are old, used across China, Japan, and Korea for thousands of years. The disposable version is much newer, and it exists for a specific reason: hygiene, in restaurants serving strangers. China's government actually promoted disposable chopsticks at first, requiring some restaurants to switch, specifically to slow the spread of disease. It would spend the next few decades trying to undo that decision. As the economy opened up and cities grew, eating out stopped being an occasion and became routine, and every takeout box came with its own disposable pair. By the late 1990s, the volume was visible everywhere. In 1998, catastrophic flooding along the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, blamed partly on upstream deforestation, forced the government to act. China banned commercial logging in natural forests across 17 provinces. In 2007, it went further, taxing disposable chopsticks directly. Neither one slowed the trend. By the time food delivery apps like Meituan and Ele.me became part of daily life for hundreds of millions of people, disposable chopsticks weren't a choice restaurants made anymore. They were infrastructure, bundled automatically into a system processing tens of millions of orders a day. Nobody picks up a pair of disposable chopsticks the way they pick a car or a phone. There's no moment of decision. You open the container and they're already there, tucked under the lid or taped to the side. You use them until the meal is finished, and then you throw them away without a second thought. Not because you decided to, but because there was never a point where you decided otherwise. That's part of why the volume is so easy to miss. A car purchase gets tracked, financed, registered, taxed. A pair of chopsticks is used once and disappears before anyone thinks to count it. What changed the scale of the habit wasn't a single decision by anyone. It was millions of these unconscious, forgettable choices repeated every day for 30 years, as more people moved to cities, more restaurants opened, and food delivery turned eating out into something that happened without leaving the apartment. That shortage of attention had a counterpart: a shortage of wood. And it sent buyers looking in places with no obvious connection to Chinese chopsticks at all. Supplying the demand meant sourcing an enormous amount of wood, and China ran into a problem almost immediately after the 1998 logging ban. Bamboo, the fastest growing and cheapest material, wasn't always what manufacturers, or their customers, wanted. Harder woods, birch especially, were often preferred, particularly for export. Russia became the obvious supplier. But starting January 1, 2007, the Russian government began raising its export tax on unprocessed logs, from 6.5% to 20% by that July, to 25% by April of 2008. The goal was to force foreign buyers to invest in processing wood inside Russia, instead of shipping it out raw. It worked. Russia's roundwood exports fell from about 49 million cubic meters in 2007 to under 22 million by 2011, less than half in 4 years. That left a gap. And in 2011, a small factory in Americus, Georgia, a town of about 17,000 people with unemployment several points above the national average, tried to fill part of it. The company was called Georgia Chopsticks. Its founders, Jay Lee and David Hughes, had noticed that South Georgia had exactly the raw material China's shortage created demand for: fast-growing poplar and sweet gum trees, cheap to harvest, requiring no bleaching before processing. Lee later told reporters it cost him less than a cent to produce a single pair. At its peak, the factory was producing around 2 million pairs a day, almost all of it exported to China, a detail later cited independently in the food historian B. Wilson's book, Consider the Fork, as an example of just how far this supply chain had stretched. In April of 2012, less than a year after it opened, Georgia Chopsticks was shut down by court order, tied to a legal dispute over a bounced check worth $1.3 million. By September, the company had filed for bankruptcy. The factory that had once shipped chopsticks to China never reopened. This is the layer where the story most people tell about chopsticks. A cheap product quietly destroying Chinese forests gets more complicated. Bo Guangxin's 2013 statement, the one behind the 80 billion figure, also claimed the industry required 20 million mature trees a year. That number has been repeated in nearly every piece of English-language reporting since, largely because no comparable, independently sourced update appears to exist. What's notable isn't really which number was more accurate. It's that more than a decade later, the industry is still being described with the same handful of estimates, none of them updated. China's own Forestry Authority has offered a different framing of the same industry. According to China's Forestry Administration, cited by the state-run Global Times, disposable chopsticks are made mostly from bamboo and leftover scraps from wood processing. And the entire industry accounts for somewhere between 0.5 and 1% of the country's total timber consumption. Those two claims aren't necessarily contradictory. An industry can consume 20 million trees a year and still represent less than 1% of total wood use, if total wood use is large enough. But it does mean the headline number describes a real business at a scale that, relative to the rest of Chinese timber consumption, is smaller than the headline suggests. That's not a story about an industry hiding its impact. It's a story about how hard it is to know the true size of something built entirely out of small, individually forgettable transactions, repeated 80 billion times a year by nobody's authoritative count. Step back from chopsticks and the pattern shows up everywhere large industries are made of small, cheap, routine purchases. A single disposable item is too small to regulate closely, too cheap to audit carefully, and too routine to notice individually. That's exactly what allows an industry built on it to reach a scale, 80 billion units a year by even the most conservative estimate, that governments themselves can't consistently measure, using data more than a decade old, without anyone treating that as unusual. It also explains why a story like Georgia Chopsticks can happen at all. A tiny factory in the American South was able to plug into a global supply chain shaped by a Russian tax policy and a Chinese logging ban, because the entire industry runs on margins thin enough and volumes large enough that a gap anywhere in the chain, a tax hike in Moscow, a bounced check in Georgia, ripples through the whole system almost immediately. Georgia Chopsticks is a useful reminder that a business can have the right market, the right raw material, and the right unit economics, and still be brought down by something much smaller. That's the real story here, more than deforestation or supply chains on their own. Convenience built at global scale, cheap enough that nobody tracks it closely, useful enough that hundreds of millions of people rely on it daily, tends to be more fragile and less well understood than its size implies. Chopsticks are an easy example to overlook. The pattern behind them isn't.